So you might remember last year I used my first iPhone in more than a decade, going from the open world of Android to Apple's walled garden. And while using other Android phones throughout 2023, I've always kept my iPhone close by. So this is going to be my 9-month-on impressions of using Apple's leading iPhones alongside the best Android has to offer. I'm Alex Dobie, this is XDA TV, let's dive in. So I spent the first 6 months of this iPhone generation with the 14 Pro before switching to the Pro Max in March of this year. And I still feel like, for most people, the smaller Pro will be the one to get. iOS feels more at home on this slightly smaller display, in part because Apple's software still doesn't really take full advantage of the larger canvas in the way that many Android phones do. You still miss out on things like split-screen multitasking and windowed app modes. That said, I was surprised that for me, as someone who's used to larger Android phones, the Pro Max actually doesn't feel super awkward to hold and use, at least not as much as I'd feared. Obviously, it's a big slab of a phone, an absolute unit compared to many compact and even not so compact Android flagships, but the benefit on the other side is easier two-handed typing and of course improved battery life. Battery life has been a challenging thing to try and quantify with these iPhones. The 13 Pro Max had the reputation of being the king of smartphone battery life in 2021, to the point where some folks felt the 14 was actually a downgrade. I don't have that experience of using the previous year's iPhones, but what I can say is neither the 14 Pro nor Pro Max have an absolute monopoly on great battery life in 2023. That's largely due to Qualcomm's excellent Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 chip, which has heralded a golden age of battery life for phones like the S23 Ultra and OnePlus 11. Either of these Android flagships can match the 14 Pro Max in longevity, managing a day and a half easily with my usage patterns, and both charge faster to boot. Point is, great battery life is no longer an exclusive iPhone feature like it seemed to be during the days of the 13 Pro Max. And meanwhile, you're still dealing with comparatively slower refills on account of Apple's more conservative attitude towards battery health. That said, battery life has definitely improved for me personally with successive iOS updates across both models, right up to iOS 16.5 at the time of talking. I never felt the battery anxiety that some iPhone 14 Pro owners were experiencing during the early days of these phones, but I do feel more confident getting to the end of the day even with heavier use with either of these two on the current firmware. There are of course many things that Apple's hardware just excels at. It's always had great haptics, although Android phones have caught up in recent years. The display too is unquestionably among the best you'll find, made ever easier on the eyes thanks to its symmetrical screen borders and True Tone color adjustment for more natural looking whites. And the iPhone's ability to adjust its brightness based on not just the light coming from the front, but also the rear, thanks to a back-facing ambient light sensor, means that display is always fully wrapped up when you need its maximum eye-searing peak brightness of 2000 nits. The actual external hardware has stood up as well as any smartphone I've used. The Max has a very minor scratch at the top of the dynamic island, while the smaller Pro has a less noticeable abrasion in its top right corner from an encounter with an airport carry-on bin. I've used both without a case and I haven't particularly babied either of these devices. That said, I also haven't dropped them on concrete or anything like that. So besides these two minor marks on the screens, both have held up really well. I guess we should also talk dynamic island here, and honestly, my opinion of this hasn't changed a whole lot over the course of my 9 months with this hardware. When it's there, it's perfectly fine, and it's a fun way to see background activities when they're running, like calls, podcasts, music, timers, and so on. The way these bubble out from the main island is nice and whimsical, and a great way to hang a lantern up what might otherwise be seen as a hardware limitation. But do I miss it when I switch back to an Android phone? Well, not really, and when I do switch back, it's just as easy to see what's going on in the background by firing up the notification shade. There are more dynamic island capabilities coming in iOS 17, and more apps are being updated to support it all the time, so I'll have to check back later in the year and see how things are progressing. Overall though, this hardware has aged pretty well so far. The A16 Bionic chip obviously has enough horsepower to lap all but the very quickest Android SoCs, only the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 can nip at its heels in some benchmarks, but there are nevertheless some areas where this iPhone seems to have one foot stuck in the past. It's the last generation of iPhone to include the Lightning port. The iPhone 15 Pro will include USB-C support finally, and also the promise of faster charging and USB data transfer speeds. Similar deal with the screen borders, which, while not horrible to look at, are thicker than Samsung's in the S23 Plus. Again, the 15 series promises to trim them down significantly. Meanwhile, if you're in the US, you'll have to deal with the futuristic inconvenience of eSIM owing to the lack of a physical SIM slot. The Max I've been using is actually the US version without a SIM slot, and while I'm sure most people buying this phone will barely notice the lack of a physical SIM, it is something that limits your options when you travel, and can cause headaches on the occasions where your carrier's systems go wrong behind the scenes. And then there are the cameras, where the 3x zoom lens of the 14 series is looking a little geriatric compared to the Android competition. 2023's Pro iPhones promise a long-awaited periscope zoom lens for closer shots. So is this camera system still competitive with Android's best and brightest? The answer is a yes, but. We've already talked about zoom, where the iPhone is annihilated by the S23 Ultra and embarrassed by the Google Pixel 7 Pro. What's more, I definitely prefer the colors output by the Pixel 7 Pro, especially in darker scenes. Although Google uses a slightly smaller sensor, it almost always outputs better looking low light scenes with more natural colors and less over-sharpening compared to the iPhone. And that was especially true in zoom shots, where with a steady hand you can take excellent 5x or 10x photos at night from the Google camera. The iPhone's nighttime output is far from bad, but I noticed a tendency to over-brighten and over-sharpen a little in the default photo profile. Speaking of which, it can also be difficult to know which of these profiles you're supposed to use at any one time. Vibrant to me sometimes looks a little overcooked, and rich contrast can also appear a little bit dark. And meanwhile, the standard profile can sometimes look a bit flat and lifeless. Apple's ultra-wide is decent, not a whole lot to write home about here, but it does the job and packs a pleasingly wide field of view that can help capture very dramatic scenes. The real area where I felt the iPhone pulled ahead though was in video. Probably no great surprise there if you followed the iPhone's camera progress over the past few years. The iPhone is one of the few devices I've owned that I know can easily be used as a replacement camera for B-roll when I'm out shooting videos. The fire and forget ease with which you can shoot great 4K 30 video that looks fine alongside the output of a prosumer camera like the Panasonic GH6 I shoot most of my stuff with is phenomenal. To be fair, the iPhone isn't entirely unique in this respect. The past year has seen some great Android video cameras, notably the Oppo Find X6 Pro with its 1-inch sensor that takes shots with glorious bokeh that sometimes beats out even footage from the iPhone. That said, there's something about the way the iPhone encodes its video that just has it looking a little bit nicer when you put it in a video editor compared to a lot of Android footage. So yeah, the iPhone doesn't have a monopoly on great video anymore, but it's still an excellent performer in this area, and I appreciate the small touches like the smooth zooming between all three lenses, which lets you avoid the jarring cuts that you often see from other phone cameras. The iOS software experience is something that's been surprisingly easy for me to fall back into whenever I pick up an iPhone, even as a longtime Android user. Sure, iOS will nudge you towards becoming ever more entangled in the Apple ecosystem over time, with things like iCloud for photo backup, and the Apple Health ecosystem that sort of acts as a gateway drug and entry funnel towards an eventual purchase of an Apple Watch. But even being half in, half out of the Apple walled garden, most of my data lives in the Google world, iOS is a pleasing experience. And I haven't felt that it's too obnoxious about pushing me towards having my entire digital life existing in the Apple world. Maybe that would be different if I lived in a country that cared even slightly about iMessage, but as it stands, the parts of iOS that I don't care about are easily ignored. Probably the most problematic software-related gripe to deal with has been the whole interaction between Apple Health, Google Fit, and Fitbit. On my Pixel, I use Fitbit, which syncs to Google Fit. Then I use a third-party app called SyncSolver on the iPhone to keep that in sync with Apple Health. And then I use a third-party widget called Hidgets to display the stats on my home screen, because most health widgets still suck. It's a bit of a digital Rube Goldberg machine, but it works well most of the time. Otherwise, I've come to quite like the way iOS looks. I'm not massively hardcore about customizing my Android phones, so the only thing I really miss is the lack of a 6x5 app grid on the larger iPhone. Aside from that, the iOS home screen is inoffensive enough, and things like widget stacks help me keep the clutter to a minimum. The lock screen and always-on display was one of my favorite additions in the iPhone 14, and it's only gotten better with the ability to show just the clock when the phone is sleeping, as opposed to a ghostly outline of your wallpaper. That saves some power, sure, but I actually just prefer the way this looks. Apple's two-tone color palettes, whimsical clock styles, and genuinely useful lock screen widgets make this important part of the UI feel more polished and enjoyable. I've generally kept weather widgets on the lock screen, so they're easily glanceable even when I'm not actively using the phone. And while I still prefer Android's more information-dense approach to lock screen notifications and just notifications in general, the enormous stack of alerts that you're sometimes presented with is at least easier to deal with on the larger display of the Pro Max. Chat apps on iOS can still be kind of annoying, or rather, trying to keep some chat apps in sync across multiple platforms is a big irritation for me. WeChat and Line are out, it's one device at a time for those services, and although WhatsApp's situation has improved significantly since last September, with up to 4 companion phones now being allowed in addition to your main phone, at the time we're recording this, the option to have an iPhone as a companion device still hasn't fully rolled out. Once it has, it should make my life a little bit easier. Finally, I want to call out just how easy it was to switch from the 14 Pro to the Pro Max, or any iPhone to a newer model for that matter. Generally, if you're staying within the same manufacturer ecosystem on Android, you'll have an easy enough time switching to a new phone. But the seamlessness with which the iPhone handles this is to be envied, including even switching your eSIM if you're on the right carrier. This side of things is something I still wish Android would do better. So the iPhone 14 Pro and Pro Max sit at a curious intersection between past and future tech. Fantastic battery life, but slow charging over an old port. A great main camera and excellent video, but lackluster telephoto compared to most of the market at large. And a great big screen, but once again it feels underutilized compared to many larger Android handsets. But that shouldn't take away from what is still an excellent and very refined experience. It's great that successive software updates have improved battery life and introduced useful changes in the always-on display. With the benefit of iOS 16.5, this feels like a more polished product than it did 9 months ago. Still, I'm a little bit conflicted here. I kinda hate that I love these phones as much as I do. I almost feel like, as an enthusiast, I should be harder on Apple for not always packing the latest cutting-edge tech and features. I miss the more innovative and quirky features I get from my Android phones, like live translation in chat apps from the Google Pixel phones, or ludicrously quick charging from Oppo and OnePlus. But it's impossible to deny the polish of the iPhone 14 Pro and Pro Max as they exist today. Give it a few months and hopefully we'll have that same level of polish, with a little more of the high-tech thrills that us phone nerds get in the Android world. That's it for now. Let me know what you think of the iPhone 14 Pro or Pro Max if you've been using one. If you like this, check out our deep dive into app sideloading, iOS 17 possibly coming to an iPhone near you very soon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.